to the Bank Talk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode features a different topic and a guest who shares their experience and knowledge with us. Tune in and learn something new with Bank Talk podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Bank Talk. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host and partner at Remedy Consulting. Today, we're going to talk about fraud again. Specifically, we had reached out to some folks within the ICBA and wanted to find out what initiatives they had going on over there, related to fraud and just kind of what approach they were taking. So we were lucky enough to get Scott Anshin, who is the head of the ICBA Fraud Taskforce, to join us today. And we thought we'd just check in and see what they're up to. So without further ado, let's get to Bank Talk. Okay, welcome back to Bank Talk. Today I have with me Scott Anshin. Scott is the VP of Operational Risk and Payments Policy at the ICBA. Scott, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Charlie. Thank you so much.
So, Scott, I usually do a little precursor before you get on. And I think when I did my precursor, I called this the ICBA Fraud Task Force, and I may have overstated that. This is, as I understand from our little bit of prep here, this is the ICBA Check Fraud Task Force. And do I have that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Charlie. And so here at ICBA, we do a lot of work, of course, on fraud, looking very broadly at the landscape. And there's a lot of different types of payment fraud occurs over different mechanisms, of course, ACH, instant payments, wire, digital assets. But really what we're focused on here is a problem that's very acute, and it's affecting our community banks on the front lines right now. And so we've really decided to focus our resources on taking a look at check fraud, bringing our members together, and seeing really what we can do collectively to address the problem. And so we're certainly concerned about fraud broadly, but check fraud is really an issue that we're focused on very, very tightly right now.
No, I get it. And, you don't want to boil the ocean, right? If you can make some progress on a little smaller issue as compared to try to solve everything, makes a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think more broadly, people are probably surprised to hear that check fraud has become a large issue rather than a small issue. And we're continuing to see instances of check fraud rise, and certainly in parallel with that, concern rising amongst the financial services industry players.
Yeah, that's great. Well, can you give me an understanding of, what are the goals and what are you trying to accomplish, and, maybe what progress are you making or trying to make there?
Yeah, I think you make a really good observation, Charlie, because I think a task force sounds great as a headline, but oftentimes they really turn into forums where folks are just sort of airing grievances and concerns. And that's an important role of a task force, no doubt. But when we put this task force together, we really thought carefully about objectives and about making this a really valuable, concrete contributor to addressing the problem. And so we were very clear in our goals. And certainly one of our goals is to serve as a forum for our members. Right now, we have upwards of 40 members and state associations that are participating in the task force. So really that represents ICBA's full geographic breadth, as well as a range of sizes amongst, community banks. And then on top of that, we have members who have both strategic oversight responsibilities and very operational on the ground responsibilities. So just a really great group of members. And so you could see as a forum, there is a lot of value there because people are bringing different perspectives and different things to the table. And then the other value, of course, when you have this diverse group, you can bring in folks from around industry, from around government to talk to them. And it's really a nice two-way sharing of things. So certainly that is a goal, and I think that that's an important goal. And you mentioned advocacy. Another goal is to sort of provide some advice to us at ICBA for where we should focus our advocacy energies in the check fraud space, because of course there's a lot that can be done. But I think the thing that excites me the most about this task force is that we've designed it to be a very concrete output producing group. And so we have organized into a series of subgroups that are focused on particular elements of check fraud, particular topics, to develop product, to develop output that can be shared amongst members and perhaps more broadly than that. We'll decide that as we go. But to really help organizations to detect, prevent, and mitigate check fraud. So again, very output oriented, doing some real on the ground work. So I think that that's the thing that differentiates this task force from some others, is that this is a roll up your sleeves, get work done kind of task force. And I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a lot of passion around obviously a lot of fear and passion maybe is probably a good way to put it when it comes to any kind of fraud. But, if it's your money, you're emotionally attached to it. So I always thought that brings out, if it's preventing somebody from stealing my money, I'll get on that task force, right?
Yeah. And maybe fear and passion is the magic recipe that we have. But I have to say, we certainly have seen an incredible amount of engagement from our members and also from our broader partners, both in government and elsewhere in industry, in coming together and contributing to this task force. And really, like I said, rolling up sleeves and getting work done. So I think it's a really encouraging sign. We're in early days. I think the task force was formed in March, maybe about the time we recorded this, about a month or a month and a half ago. But the amount of momentum that we've built in that short amount of time has just been really, really encouraging.
Okay. How did you decide to structure the organization or the subcommittees or however you're developed there?
Yeah, so I think about the task force as being almost like an analog to the U.S. Congress. So we have our full task force, which is our discussion and ultimate decision-making body. But when we dive down into specific topics, we have subgroups that really do the work and create the outputs and then bring those to the full task force for kind of review and a stamp of approval. So right now we've formed quite a number of subgroups, and some of the subgroups are standing committees, like in Congress, and some of them are more ad hoc short-term committees. So we've had a couple of ad hoc subgroups already to review some of ICBA's advocacy products and to give us some feedback on those. And also we had one which was designed to provide the initial list of topics that the task force would subsequently address. And so that in many ways was a trial of the subgroup to the larger group process. It worked really well, generated a list of ideas that we brought to the full task force to discuss. And we've now formed subgroups to discuss particular topics.
Mm-hmm.
I'll share some of those topics with you right now.
Yeah.
I will say that, it's up to the subgroups to discuss these items and ultimately, along with the full task force, to make a decision about whether there will be outputs or what the final products will look like. So, it may not take this final form when things are issued, but just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're looking at, I think is valuable. Right now, we have a subgroup that's focused on sort of forms and documents that are valuable in investigating and pursuing claims related to check fraud. Of course, you have affidavits and you have things like that folks can fill out. And so it's valuable, again, to come together as an industry and look at best practices there. What does a good affidavit look like? What does a good agreement for this or that look like? So we have a subgroup that's focused on that. We have a subgroup that's focused on engagement with regulators. What are the right times to engage and how best do we do that? We have a subgroup that's looking at the difference between counterfeit and altered checks. There's an important nuance here because a counterfeit check and an altered check have different liabilities and defenses attached to them. And so it's a very consequential decision to make whether a check is counterfeit or altered. We have a subgroup that's looking at fraud detection mechanisms. So there's both human and technology solutions, of course. We're seeing an explosion everywhere, obviously, not just in the check fraud or financial services space, of AI and machine learning type tools, looking at some best practices there, but also some of the human solutions related to check fraud. One of the real benefits of community banking, of the whole model, is the relationship-oriented nature of it. And so our community banks really know their customers at sort of deep and meaningful and personal levels. And so there's a lot of benefit to be had from some of that human touch the community banks have with their customers in terms of preventing check fraud. And then related to that, sort of the final subgroup we have is looking at the best ways to engage with customers on the front lines. Of course, anyone accepting a check for deposit or customers that are writing checks, the bank that's directly touching those things is in a potentially good position to detect that fraud. So, like I said, we have a range of these subgroups that are looking at issues across the spectrum. And again, it's not just talk, it's sitting down and it's looking at what specific outputs can we generate that will bring value here and really move some of these questions forward.
That's excellent. And I think you hit it on the head. You nailed the whole question. Because I was going to ask subgroups versus topics, and it sounds like they're tied together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that any task force at some point has to sunset because it will have fulfilled its purpose. But once we get through this round of topics, we can do a little bit of self-evaluation and think about, is there another round of topics that we need to address? And I think that the number of topics out there is infinite. So, if there's appetite, I think we'll keep going as long as that appetite exists.
Yeah, and I like the topics from the perspective of, I could see people joining any one of those, right? There isn't one that's a laggard, right? They're all pretty interesting. But you know what I mean? They're all topics that you could easily find somebody with expertise in, and you could easily find some folks with some passion for.
Yeah. And like I said, our membership is very diverse. We have folks on the task force that are coming at it from a strategic C-suite perspective. And we have folks who are working in operations at branches and interacting directly with customers. So to be able to bring that range of perspectives to some of this work, I think is very unique. And again, a strength of community banking model as a whole is that those strategic folks are very close to the operations folks. And we hope to bring that holistic perspective to some of this work.
You had mentioned the difference between a counterfeit and an altered check. I think I understand that answer, but can you give it to me at a high level? What's the difference between a counterfeit check and a check that has been altered?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a check is stolen from the mail or something like that, a fraudster can watch the check, so change the information on the check, alter it, and then redeposit, or can use the account information on the check to create a completely new check that was not altered. It's just a brand new fake check, essentially. And so the rights and responsibilities associated with counterfeit and altered checks are different. So
would an altered check be you change the dollar amount and the payee?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a counterfeit?
That's exactly right. That's an altered check. And I think it's a fine line, Charlie, between what's an alteration and what's a counterfeit. Okay. And I think that that's something that folks are struggling with because there's no clear definition and no clear guidance on when you cross that line. But again, the rights and responsibilities are different, whether it's an altered check or a counterfeit check. So
there's a legal implication, you're saying, as far as how to pursue it or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so oftentimes, if litigation should result as a result of one of these situations, it's a question of fact. Is it an altered check or a counterfeit check? And so I think our task force wants to dive a little bit deeper on how do you identify the difference there and what are the implications of that difference? This is a really, really important thing to look at. I don't think there's easy answers. I think the easiest answer would be, this is defined somewhere and it's very clear. But certainly, it's not that cut and dry. And again, in the age of artificial intelligence and things like that, it becomes even more blurry. When
it's almost like the legal landscape maybe hasn't caught up yet with the technology or the how forward-facing these fraudsters are, right, to some degree. I mean, they came up with methods way before the law could figure out that there might be a differentiation between the two.
Yeah, and certainly, this isn't an independent, unique observation, but it's a bit of an arms race, between financial institutions, fraudsters, and really the law and regulatory system. I think that the law and regulatory system is right to be deliberate about making changes and making decisions here. What we've emphasized at ICBA is we're really behind industry-led solutions to some of these issues. To the extent that we can provide some guidance and do some research that's of value in this space from an industry perspective, we think that there's a lot of value there rather than, maybe jumping quickly into some sort of, more permanent changes.
We'll be right back.
If you're dealing with a technology vendor, consider giving Remedy Consulting a call. At Remedy, We're dedicated to helping our clients get the most out of their tech spend. If you're considering changing one of your major tech providers or are renewing a contract with a vendor, the Remedy team may be able to add some value. Our clients enjoy our deep experience working inside these major vendors, and that background helps us ask questions which eliminate headaches and expense for our clients. Sometimes that's immediate relief, in the way of your vendor invoices, and sometimes that comes in the form of contract language protection for a strategic move that you may want to make several years later. The group of experts at Remedy have years of experience in core systems, digital, mobile, payments, item capture, commercial banking, pretty much the whole gamut of technology for financial institutions. Remedy approaches the BankTalk podcast the same way we approach our client engagements. We always try to fill some knowledge gaps, but also just have enough life experience stories to remain entertaining. So if you're renewing a technology contract or you have projects going on, just need another opinion or a project manager from outside your organization, reach out to us at remedyconsult.net. Thank you, and we appreciate you downloading the BankTalk podcast. Now let's get back to our episode. Can you give us a feel for, what's that interaction look like between the agencies and either the ICBA Taskforce or the agencies and anybody else that's fighting that's fighting this fraud at a bank or a credit union level? Financial institution versus the government. How do you see that relationship and what's going on there?
Yeah. So I think what's very encouraging is that there's been a lot of collaboration and a lot of openness, both within industry and between industry and government. I think that check fraud is an issue that everybody recognizes is a problem, and it has, broad ranging effects. It's not the kind of issue where, some people are for it and some people are against it. Of course, everybody's against check fraud. So people are really willing to put aside competitive concerns, competitive differences, and sit down at the table and think about the best ways to resolve this. So what we've seen is a really broad positive response across the whole spectrum to check fraud. So we, of course, have the U.S. Postal Inspection Service that's doing a lot of great work to bolster physical security, to prevent mail fraud, mail theft, I should say, and also, to move forward with prosecuting cases as appropriate. We've seen the financial regulatory agencies, the OCC, the FDIC, the Fed, really kind of leaning into the problem. They've all set up check fraud complaint mailboxes that folks can use to sort of share concerns when they have a check fraud issue, especially when there's an issue related to coordination among banks. I referred before, of course, to the difference between counterfeit and altered checks, which affects liability. Occasionally, we see disputes between banks about how those things should be handled. And so the regulators have been very sort of open to hearing those concerns and helping to refer those concerns to the right places within banks. So that's been really positive. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, has been doing a lot of good work collecting complaints about check fraud and investigating check fraud vis-a-vis cybercrime. And so we've seen a great response across federal agencies. But the thing that we've also seen that gives me even more hope and encouragement is that all of these agencies, or most of these agencies at least, have been very willing to come speak to and work with our check fraud task force. So we have, in the relatively short time that the task force has been in operation, have already built relationships with some of these groups. We've had them come speak to the task force. We've had some great back and forth discussions where they're listening to feedback from our community bank members. They're sharing information with our community bank members. And so it's been a real positive back and forth. And I'll say, even more broadly from an industry-wide perspective, same thing. There's a lot of parallel and complementary efforts out there. And so everybody's been very willing to work together and engage. So I think here we're really seeing the power of collaboration across the industry. And I expect as we move forward, some of this work will start to converge and we'll see more and more products kind of hitting the street and more joint efforts to really make an impact on check fraud. I think the other thing is as a result of this, we've really built up an awareness about concerns related to check fraud. Maybe a year ago, it was less prominent, less present outside of the industry. But I think now we're seeing a broader recognition as a result of some of this collaborative work. So all in all, I think I feel very bullish on the prospects of broad industry collaboration.
And do you think that industry collaboration across the agencies, they must be talking to each other to get the ones that are doing it in volume, I'm assuming, right? The organizations that are a little broader or a little more sophisticated.
And I think that, within the federal government, folks are starting to talk, about potential solutions here. And there are a lot of solutions, a lot of things that don't necessarily require opening up regulations or passing new laws. Really just some interagency collaboration goes a long way. And my sense is that as a result of efforts like the task force and some of the complementary efforts, they're listening and they're really understanding that the issue is real and that it's going to take collective action from more than one party to make a difference.
Is there a standard out there for convictions? In other words, I would think that at a certain point, somebody would say, look, today we convict, bring to trial or something, a certain percentage of these fraudsters that are known to us. And target, maybe we get 20% of them and our target is 35%. Is there any type of a standard out there for reducing the overall number or reducing the conviction rate or reducing something? And then I'm not even talking about within the ICBA task force, because obviously you guys are relatively new at it, but does anybody have a goal?
And I think that in conversations I've had with some of the law enforcement and regulatory agencies, I get the sense that as they allocate scarce resources, and I don't mean scarce in a pejorative sense, I just mean, of course, resources, there's bounds around resources available to all these agencies. I think that they're emphasizing more and more that law enforcement element and the need to sort of identify and prosecute cases where a difference can really be made. The amazing thing is that these fraudsters have been pretty brazen and visible in some of their efforts to organize and engage in check fraud. So for folks familiar with Telegram, a lot of the organized crime occurs on Telegram, where walkers are recruited. We have fraudsters who are bragging about, the checks that they've stolen and can sort of wash and change. And so I think that as this has become more and more visible and known to law enforcement, I think that they're absolutely stepping up their efforts to identify cases where they can make progress. As to whether there are any targets, that I certainly don't know. But I think that as awareness grows of the problem and the mechanisms that are used, I absolutely think that some of the resources that were previously allocated elsewhere are moving toward prosecution. And that's absolutely something that we support. Our task force hasn't really looked at that element of check fraud mitigation, but we certainly support law enforcement efforts here. I think that that's an absolutely key, leg of this response.
No, and I think that's a great answer, because I kind of expected the answer was no, right? That because to put a number on it, it would be really tough when you just think about, the fact that these things are popping up all the time and there's a lot of stuff going on there. But, just to me, think of how compelling it would be to say, we catch 80% of these guys or 90 or something. That's a great deterrent if we say, you know what I mean? And maybe the deterrent today is, publicly throw them and, put them up and, put them in court and make sure that they go to jail and make sure that all their buddies see it. Right.
Yeah. And I think, to the point of how these fraudsters have become a little bit more brazen and public in sort of bragging about the checks that they've stolen and that they have available in some of their very surprisingly public recruitment efforts. Yeah, I think that potentially there's opportunities to highlight when one of those folks disappears from Telegram or something like that because they've been, prosecuted and convicted.
All right. So me as a consumer, not as a bank, but I'm not a huge check user, but I am kind of, right? Meaning I've got business checks and some other things that go out the door, as well as a little bit of personal, not a lot less than it used to be. What's the best way, if you had advice for me as a consumer, what's the best way for me to reduce my check fraud risk tomorrow?
Yeah,
Is it?
I think that's a great question, Charlie, because like I said, I think that it's a shared responsibility across the ecosystem to reduce check fraud. So that ranges from, everyone from the consumer to the financial institution to some of the software providers to government regulators. So I think absolutely that the first point in stopping check fraud lies with the consumer. And so I think it's a good question. I have a couple of thoughts on things that folks can do. The primary thing that folks can do is to move to electronic payments whenever possible, because there you're subject to different protections. And when you make a bill pay payment, oftentimes it's an ACH payment in reality. It's not really a true check.
Oh, good point. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And so I think that to the extent that you can use electronic payments like that, whether it's ACH or instant payments, I think that you're doing a great service both to yourself and to sort of the broader industry. Another tool that banks are starting to offer, and typically they offer these to business customers rather than personal customers, but I think that we'll see this use expanding, is my guess, is a tool called Positive Pay. So I don't know if you're familiar with Positive Pay, but with Positive Pay, you're basically telling the bank about the check that you wrote so that when they can verify that the check that's cashed is actually consistent with what you wrote. So if it's not, they can sort of stop the fraud right there. So using tools like that when they're available, I think is really valuable. And I think the other thing is just, you got to be mindful about who you're sending a check to. If you don't have to do it, or if it seems a little bit suspect, or if you're mailing a check in an envelope that exposes the fact that there's a check in there, maybe think twice. I think, security by obscurity goes a long way. So, concealing the fact that you're sending checks or providing checks, I think is really valuable. But I think,
No, I think that's great advice. I know there's a move towards ACH, and there's a move towards anything you can do to make sure it doesn't go. If it doesn't go in the mail, it's a lot harder to. It's right. It's a lot harder to counterfeit, and that does.
Yeah,
make a ton of sense.
I think that's exactly right. And I think simple things like just monitoring your account. Now that we have all these tools where your bank can push you alerts and things like that, and so being aware when these things happen, and if there's an issue, if something looks discrepant, you got to report that right away to your bank and let them help you out. Again, I like to tout the benefits here of community banking. They're well familiar with their customers and the types of transactions they typically conduct. When you bank with a community bank, they're more than likely to catch these issues and sort of help you out. So, you got to monitor, you got to work with your bank. I think there's a lot of benefit to be had in that relationship.
That's a great perspective, because I think I can honestly say, on the credit card side, right, that I never was a big fan of getting a notification every couple of minutes, whenever something got used, because I've got enough email, I got enough stuff coming my way anyhow, right? But recently, we'll put the app on my phone for, credit card transactions, and we actually have caught 2 or 3 fraudulent transactions. Just because I get a notification, I'm like, wait, that's not me, right? I saw a transaction go through. That's not something that, myself or anybody that's got access to the card would have done. I don't know that I've seen it across the board for checks the same way, but nothing to say that's not coming as a technology. It just confirming we just cleared check number, whatever, right? And that check number was for X number of bucks, and it was written out to ABC.
Yeah, exactly. And to the extent that you have a relationship with your bank, I mean, these are features that you can ask for, alerts that particular check has been cashed, and, maybe pushing the image to you so you can take a look at it and make sure it looks like exactly what you wrote. I think those are valuable things. Even to the extent that checks aren't electronic payments, some of our technology has made monitoring even non-electronic payments a lot easier.
Okay. Well, Scott, I wanted to say thank you for joining us. This has been great. The material that we covered here is exactly what I was hoping for. So appreciate you spending a little time with us on Bank Talk, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely, Charlie. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, so that's it for Bank Talk. Thank you for listening today. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for listening to the Bank Talk podcast, brought to you by Remedy Consulting. To reach out to Scott Anchin, please email him at scott.anchin j.anchin@icba.org. If you like what you hear, please rate, review, and share our work with others. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next episode.